By the year 2050, nearly 5 billion people will live in regions facing severe water stress. Not water inconvenience, not water discomfort, water crisis. The kind where entire cities run dry, where agriculture collapses across continents, where governments fall not because of ideology, but because the tap stopped running. And while the rest of the world debates the problem, two nations on opposite ends of the earth with radically different philosophies are already engineering their answers. One is the largest country on the planet. The other is roughly the size of New Jersey. One moves rivers across mountain ranges and reshapes the hydrology of an entire continent. The other turns seawater into some of the cheapest drinking water on Earth and recycles nearly every drop that flows through its borders. The strange part is, both approaches work. The terrifying part is, neither might be enough. And the question almost nobody is asking, the one that will define the next century of human civilization, is deceptively simple. When the wells run dry, when the aquifers collapse, when billion-dollar cities face the unthinkable reality of having no water, who do they call? Because the answer to that question will determine who holds power over the most essential resource in human history. Not oil, not lithium, not data. Water. This is the story of two water superpowers taking completely opposite bets on the future of the most critical substance on the planet. China, with its colossal infrastructure and centralized planning, is physically rerouting the geography of water, moving it hundreds of miles across mountains, deserts, and political boundaries through engineering projects so large they make the Three Gorges Dam look like a warm-up exercise. Israel, with virtually no natural freshwater resources, has turned technological desperation into global dominance. Pioneering desalination plants, drip irrigation systems, and wastewater recycling programs that now serve as the blueprint for arid nations around the world. On the surface, this looks like a straightforward comparison between big and small, brute force and precision. But underneath, there's something far more consequential playing out. This is a race for geopolitical influence, for economic leverage, and ultimately, for survival. There are hidden limitations to both strategies, unexpected risks that neither country has fully solved, and a looming question about whether any nation, no matter how advanced, can truly control something as unpredictable as water. The deeper you look, the more unsettling it becomes. If you're fascinated by massive engineering, future technology, and the forces that will reshape our world, subscribe to NextBreakdown, hit the like button, and drop a comment telling us which country you think has the better strategy. Let's get into it. Before we compare strategies, we need to understand the scale of what both nations are up against. Because the global water crisis isn't a future problem. It's already here, and it's accelerating faster than most projections predicted. The numbers are staggering. Around 2.2 billion people currently lack access to safely managed drinking water. Groundwater, the invisible reservoir beneath the Earth's surface that supplies roughly 30% of the world's freshwater, is being pumped out far faster than nature can replenish it. Major aquifer systems in India, the Middle East, northern China, and the American West are in measurable decline, some approaching the point of no return. And climate change is compressing this timeline even further. Glaciers that feed rivers serving hundreds of millions of people are shrinking. Rainfall patterns are shifting in ways that no existing infrastructure was designed to handle. What used to be predictable seasonal monsoons in Asia are becoming erratic, dumping catastrophic floods in some years and delivering devastating droughts in others. Here's the part that rarely makes headlines. Water stress doesn't just mean people get thirsty. It means food production collapses, because agriculture consumes roughly 70% of all fresh water used globally. It means energy grids buckle, because hydroelectric dams need steady water flow, and thermal power plants need massive volumes for cooling. It means industries shut down, supply chains break, and economies contract. Some analysts now estimate that by 2030, global water demand will exceed sustainable supply by roughly 40%. That gap isn't a rounding error, it's a civilizational challenge. This is the backdrop against which China and Israel have built their respective water empires. Both nations faced existential water threats. Both decided that failure was not an option. But the paths they chose could not be more different, and the consequences of those choices are only now becoming clear. China's crisis is defined by a cruel geographic paradox. The country holds roughly 6% of the world's fresh water, but supports nearly 18% of the world's population. Worse, that water is distributed with almost absurd unevenness. Roughly 80% of China's fresh water is concentrated in the south, while the arid north, home to hundreds of millions of people, critical farmland, and major industrial centers, including Beijing, operates under chronic water scarcity. Northern China's per capita water availability is comparable to some of the driest regions in the Middle East. For a country that aspires to global economic dominance, this isn't just inconvenient, it's a structural vulnerability that threatens everything. Israel's crisis is different in character, but equal in severity. The country sits at the edge of the world's most water-poor region. Its natural freshwater sources, the Sea of Galilee and a handful of aquifers, have been overexploited for decades, pushed to the brink by population growth, agricultural demand, and recurring droughts that have become more intense with each passing decade. For most of its modern history, Israel faced a simple and brutal equation: either solve the water problem or cease to exist as a viable state. There was no room for incremental progress. The margin of error was zero. Both countries stared into the same abyss. What they built in response reveals fundamentally different philosophies about engineering, nature, and control. China's approach to water scarcity is, in a word, monumental. When Chinese engineers looked at the map and saw 80% of the nation's freshwater trapped in the south, while the north withered, they didn't redesign consumption patterns or optimize usage. They decided to move the water, physically, across a continent. The South-to-North Water Diversion Project is the single largest water infrastructure undertaking in human history. First conceptualized by Mao Zedong in 1952, the project spent decades in planning before construction began in 2002. The idea was staggeringly ambitious. Build 3 massive canal routes stretching thousands of kilometers to transfer billions of cubic meters of water annually from the Yangtze River Basin in the south to the parched Yellow River Basin and the densely populated cities of the north, including Beijing and Tianjin. The eastern route follows the path of the ancient Grand Canal, using a series of pumping stations to lift water northward across the flat terrain of eastern China. The middle route, completed in 2014, stretches over 1,400 kilometers and relies on gravity to carry water from the Danjiangkou Reservoir in Hubei Province all the way to Beijing. The western route, the most ambitious and controversial of the three, would tunnel through the Tibetan Plateau to divert water from the upper reaches of the Yangtze to the upper Yellow River. As of now, the western route remains largely in the planning stage, and some engineers quietly question whether it's even technically feasible at the scale envisioned. The numbers behind this project are almost incomprehensible. The middle route alone required the relocation of over 300,000 people from their homes. The total projected cost has ballooned past $80 billion and continues to climb. The infrastructure includes massive aqueducts, tunnels bored through mountains, canal systems carved across hundreds of miles of terrain, and pumping stations powerful enough to push water uphill against natural drainage patterns. When the project is fully operational, China aims to transfer roughly 45 billion cubic meters of water per year, a volume equivalent to the annual flow of a major world river. And in some respects, it's working. Beijing has received billions of cubic meters of diverted water through the middle route. The city's groundwater levels, which had been in free fall for decades, have partially stabilized. Millions of people in northern China now drink water that originated more than 1,000 kilometers to the south. As a feat of raw engineering and political will, it's difficult to overstate what China has accomplished. But here's where the picture starts to crack. The environmental cost has been enormous. Diverting water from the Yangtze system reduces flow downstream, impacting ecosystems, fisheries, and sediment transport that keeps the river delta stable. Some ecologists warn that long-term diversion at this scale could destabilize the very basin China depends on for southern agriculture, effectively robbing one region to save another. The Three Gorges Dam, already a source of significant ecological disruption, now operates in a system that is being further stressed by large-scale water extraction. Pollution is another hidden limitation. The eastern route, which passes through some of China's most industrialized regions, has struggled with water quality. Despite billions spent on treatment and cleanup, portions of the water transferred along this route have been criticized for failing to meet safe drinking standards. Moving dirty water 1,000 kilometers doesn't make it clean, and the ongoing cost of purification adds a financial burden that was underestimated during the planning phase. Then there's the social dimension. The hundreds of thousands of people displaced to make room for reservoirs and canals have faced challenges that extend far beyond relocation. Communities have been fractured, livelihoods destroyed, and compensation has been, according to various reports, inconsistent and insufficient. The human cost of rearranging a nation's hydrology doesn't appear in the engineering blueprints, but it's real, and it creates political risks that China's leadership must manage carefully. Perhaps most critically, some experts believe the South-to-North project, for all its scale, is a temporary fix masking a deeper structural problem. Northern China's water consumption patterns, driven by heavy industry, coal-fired power, and water-intensive agriculture, are fundamentally unsustainable. Diverting southern water buys time, but it doesn't change the underlying equation. Critics argue that China is spending tens of billions of dollars to delay a reckoning rather than prevent one. And if climate change reduces the Yangtze's flow, a scenario that some climate models suggest is plausible in coming decades, the entire system could face a crisis of supply at the source. If that surprises you, hit like, because we're just getting started. Israel's strategy is the philosophical inverse of China's. Where China moves water across a continent, Israel manufactures it from the sea and squeezes maximum value from every liter that exists. The result is arguably the most efficient water economy on Earth, built not from abundance, but from sheer necessity. The centerpiece of Israel's water revolution is desalination. The country now operates 5 major desalination plants along its Mediterranean coast, with additional capacity under construction. The largest, the Sorek facility south of Tel Aviv, produces roughly 150 million cubic meters of drinkable water per year, making it one of the largest and most advanced reverse osmosis desalination plants in the world. Collectively, these plants supply approximately 80% of Israel's domestic water, a figure that would have seemed like science fiction 30 years ago. The engineering behind modern desalination is deceptively elegant. Seawater is forced under high pressure through semi-permeable membranes that filter out salt and impurities at the molecular level. What emerges is clean, drinkable water at a cost that has plummeted over the past 2 decades. Israel now produces desalinated water for roughly 50 to 60 cents per cubic meter, a fraction of what it cost in the early 2000s. Energy recovery systems, advanced membrane materials, and relentless process optimization have brought the cost down to levels that are competitive with traditional freshwater sources in many parts of the world. But desalination is only part of the story. Israel's second masterstroke is wastewater recycling, and in this area, no other nation on Earth comes close. Israel recycles approximately 90% of its wastewater for agricultural use. 90%. The global average is barely 3 to 5%. Spain, often cited as Europe's leader in this area, recycles roughly 20%. The infrastructure behind this achievement includes hundreds of treatment facilities, a national pipeline network that distributes reclaimed water to farms across the country, and regulatory frameworks that mandate recycling at a scale no other government has attempted. The third pillar is drip irrigation, a technology that Israel didn't just adopt, but essentially invented for modern agriculture. Netafim, the Israeli company that pioneered commercial drip irrigation in the 1960s, transformed global farming by delivering water directly to plant roots through a network of tubes and emitters, reducing water use by 40 to 60% compared to traditional flood irrigation. Today, drip irrigation technology developed in Israel is used in over 110 countries and has become the standard for precision agriculture in water-scarce regions worldwide. The cumulative effect of these three technologies is remarkable. Israel has effectively decoupled its water supply from rainfall. Droughts still occur. The years between 2013 and 2018 brought some of the worst dry conditions in 900 years. But they no longer trigger water emergencies. The Sea of Galilee, which had been shrinking alarmingly for decades, has been partially relieved of its burden as desalination has taken over the heavy lifting for domestic supply. Israel went from chronic water shortage to water surplus in roughly 15 years, a transformation that some analysts describe as the most significant resource revolution of the 21st century. And now, Israel is exporting this revolution. Israeli water technology companies operate on every inhabited continent. Governments from India to California to sub-Saharan Africa have turned to Israeli expertise for desalination, irrigation, and water management solutions. IDE Technologies, the company behind the Sorek plant, has built desalination facilities in China, the United States, Australia, and across the Middle East. Israel's water sector has become a significant source of diplomatic leverage and economic revenue, a soft power tool disguised as engineering. But Israel's model has its own hidden limitations. Desalination is energy-intensive. Despite dramatic efficiency improvements, producing fresh water from seawater still requires substantial electricity. Israel's plants run largely on natural gas, which means the nation's water supply is partially tethered to fossil fuel markets and energy security. If energy prices spike or supply chains are disrupted, the cost of water rises with them. Some critics argue that Israel has traded water dependence for energy dependence, a vulnerability that is manageable now but could become precarious as geopolitical tensions in the region fluctuates. There's also the brine problem. Desalination produces concentrated saltwater waste, brine, that must be disposed of, typically by pumping it back into the sea. At small scales, the ocean can absorb this, but as desalination capacity grows globally, some marine biologists have raised concerns about the cumulative impact of brine discharge on coastal ecosystems. The Mediterranean, a relatively enclosed sea, is particularly vulnerable. Long-term, large-scale brine disposal could damage the very marine environment that desalination depends on. And there's a scalability question that matters enormously for the global picture. Israel is a small country with a coastline. Its model works beautifully for nations with ocean access and the financial resources to build advanced infrastructure. But what about landlocked countries? What about nations with thousands of kilometers of arid interior and no coast? What about countries that simply can't afford 50 cents per cubic meter water when their citizens earn a few dollars a day? Israel's technology is extraordinary, but its direct applicability to the world's most severe water crises, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Central Asia, in landlocked developing nations, remains limited without significant adaptation and external financing. Comment below if you think Israel's approach can truly scale to solve global water scarcity, or if it's a solution that only works for wealthy coastal nations. Here's where this story shifts from engineering to something far more complex. Water technology isn't just about pipes and membranes, it's about power. And both China and Israel understand this with crystal clarity. China's water ambitions extend far beyond its own borders. The country sits upstream of some of the most important transboundary rivers in Asia: the Mekong, the Brahmaputra, the Indus tributaries, rivers that sustain hundreds of millions of people in Southeast Asia and South Asia, have their headwaters in Chinese-controlled territory, much of it on the Tibetan Plateau. China has built dozens of dams on the upper Mekong, a river that flows through Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, before emptying into the South China Sea. Downstream nations have reported dramatic changes in water flow, seasonal patterns, and sediment delivery since China's dam construction accelerated. Changes that affect fisheries, agriculture, and flood management across the entire region. Some analysts describe China's upstream position as the ultimate geopolitical leverage. By controlling the source of rivers that other nations depend on for survival, China holds a card that no amount of diplomacy or military spending can counter. There's growing concern among neighboring countries that China could, in theory, weaponize water, restricting flow during disputes or using dam operations as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations. China has consistently denied any intent to manipulate transboundary water flows. But the structural reality remains. The infrastructure to do so already exists. The Brahmaputra situation is particularly sensitive. This river, which originates in Tibet and flows through India and Bangladesh before reaching the Bay of Bengal, is a lifeline for hundreds of millions of people. China has built hydropower facilities on the upper Brahmaputra, and there have been persistent reports, disputed by Beijing, of plans for larger diversion projects that could reduce downstream flow into India's northeast. Any significant reduction would have catastrophic consequences for agriculture and drinking water in one of the most densely populated regions on Earth. India has watched these developments with deep unease, and the Brahmaputra has become a flashpoint in the broader China-India strategic rivalry. China has also embedded itself in global water infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese companies have built dams, irrigation systems, and water treatment facilities across Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, often financed by Chinese state banks. These projects extend China's influence while creating long-term dependencies. Nations that rely on Chinese-built infrastructure, Chinese-trained engineers, and Chinese-financed debt for their water security. It's a model that mirrors what China has done with ports, railways, and telecommunications, and its implications for global water governance are profound. Israel's geopolitical water game is different, but equally consequential. Water has been a central factor in Middle Eastern conflict for decades. Israel's control over water resources in the occupied West Bank, where Palestinian access to groundwater is heavily restricted, remains one of the most contentious aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. International human rights organizations have criticized the disparity in water access between Israeli settlers and Palestinian communities, describing it as a structural inequality embedded in the occupation. But Israel has also used water as a diplomatic bridge. In 2016, Israel and Jordan signed a landmark agreement to build a joint desalination facility on the Red Sea, with Israel providing technology and Jordan receiving a portion of the desalinated water. The deal was framed as a model for regional cooperation in an area where water scarcity affects every nation. Similar agreements have been explored with Egypt, and, in the context of the Abraham Accords, with Gulf states that face their own severe freshwater challenges. Israel's water diplomacy extends to unexpected places. India, one of the world's most water-stressed large nations, has deepened its partnership with Israel on agricultural water technology. Israel has helped establish centers of excellence for water management across Indian states, transferring drip irrigation and micro-irrigation techniques to Indian farmers. This technology transfer has quietly become one of the strongest pillars of the India-Israel relationship, less visible than defense deals, but arguably more consequential for India's long-term stability. The strategic calculus for both nations is clear. In a world where water becomes the defining scarcity of the century, the countries that control the technology, the infrastructure, and the upstream geography will hold disproportionate global influence. China and Israel are positioning themselves as the two indispensable players in this space, one through sheer scale and geographic control, the other through technological superiority and exportable expertise. Subscribe to Next Breakdown if you want to keep exploring the technologies and power plays shaping our future. There's a dimension to this rivalry that neither government talks about openly, but that engineers and climate scientists are watching with increasing urgency. Both China's infrastructure-first approach and Israel's technology-first approach share a common assumption: that human ingenuity can outpace the deterioration of natural water systems. And there's growing evidence that this assumption may be dangerously optimistic. China's mega-infrastructure is designed for a hydrological reality that may not hold. The South-to-North Water Diversion Project was engineered based on historical flow data from the Yangtze River. But climate models suggest that the Yangtze's behavior is changing. Glacial melt from the Tibetan Plateau, which contributes significantly to the river's base flow, is accelerating as global temperatures rise. In the short term, this actually increases water availability. But once those glaciers shrink past a critical threshold, the melt contribution drops off a cliff, and the river's dry season flow could decline substantially. Some researchers estimate that this tipping point could arrive within 30 to 50 years, well within the operational lifespan of the diversion infrastructure. If the Yangtze delivers less water, the entire rationale of the South-to-North project begins to unravel. Simultaneously, northern China's groundwater depletion continues at alarming rates. The North China Plain, one of the country's most important agricultural regions, sits above an aquifer that has been dropping by roughly 1 meter per year in some areas. The South-to-North project was supposed to relieve pressure on this groundwater, but the transferred water has not fully replaced pumping because demand continues to grow alongside population and industrial expansion. Some hydrogeologists have described the North China Plain aquifer as being in a state of slow-motion collapse. And once a major aquifer compacts and loses its storage capacity, that loss is essentially permanent. No amount of surface water transfer can restore it. China has recognized these risks and is investing in complementary technologies. The country has become the world's largest builder of desalination capacity, with major plants in Tianjin, Qingdao, and other coastal cities. Chinese companies are also investing heavily in atmospheric water generation, cloud seeding, and advanced water treatment technologies. China's cloud seeding program is by far the largest in the world. The government claims it can increase rainfall over targeted areas by deploying aircraft, rockets, and ground-based generators that release silver iodide particles into moisture-laden clouds. The program has been expanded to cover vast sections of the Tibetan Plateau and western China, with plans to create a rain enhancement zone covering an area larger than most European countries. But the science behind cloud seeding remains contested. While there's evidence that it can marginally increase precipitation under the right atmospheric conditions, the magnitude and reliability of those increases are debated among meteorologists. Some experts argue that China's cloud seeding claims are overstated, and that the technology is being promoted as much for domestic political reassurance as for genuine hydrological benefit. Modifying weather at scale raises additional concerns about unintended consequences, including the possibility that increasing rainfall in one region could reduce it in neighboring areas, creating transboundary tensions that add a new layer to an already complex geopolitical picture. Israel faces a different set of technological uncertainties. Desalination membrane technology has improved dramatically, but it's approaching physical limits in terms of energy efficiency. The thermodynamic minimum energy required to separate salt from water is well established, and current best-in-class plants are already operating within a factor of 2 or 3 of that theoretical minimum. Further cost reductions will increasingly come from renewable energy integration rather than membrane improvements, which means Israel's water costs are becoming tightly linked to its energy transition strategy. There's also a less discussed vulnerability in Israel's system: its dependence on centralized infrastructure. Israel's 5 major desalination plants are critical nodes in the national water network. A coordinated attack, a major earthquake, a catastrophic equipment failure, or even a cyber attack targeting plant operations could disrupt water supply to millions of people within hours. Israel's military and intelligence apparatus takes this threat extremely seriously. But the concentration of water production in a handful of coastal facilities creates an inherent fragility that distributed natural water systems don't have. In an era of increasing geopolitical volatility and cyber warfare, this is not a theoretical concern. Both nations are also grappling with the economic sustainability of their approaches. China's water infrastructure requires continuous investment in maintenance, pumping energy, and pollution control, costs that will compound over decades. Israel's desalination plants have operational lifespans of 25 to 30 years before major components need replacement. Neither model is a one-time investment. Both require perpetual funding, political commitment, and technological upgrading. The moment that investment falters, due to economic downturn, political transition, or competing priorities, the system begins to degrade. There's a deeper philosophical question here that neither country's official narrative addresses. Are we engineering our way out of a water crisis? Or are we engineering our way into a deeper dependency on systems that are themselves vulnerable to the very climate disruption that caused the crisis in the first place? Some environmental scientists argue that both approaches, moving rivers and desalinating seas, treat symptoms rather than causes, and that the real solution lies in fundamentally restructuring how human civilization uses water. Reducing consumption, redesigning agriculture, restoring natural watersheds, and accepting ecological limits. This perspective is rarely popular with governments or engineers, but it's gaining traction in academic circles as the scale of global water stress becomes harder to ignore. If this is making you rethink what you thought you knew about water security, hit the like button. There's one more critical piece to this story. Perhaps the most consequential dimension of the China-Israel water rivalry isn't what happens inside their borders. It's what happens outside them. Because the real prize isn't securing domestic water supply. It's becoming the country that the rest of the world depends on when the crisis hits. And it will hit. The World Bank estimates that water scarcity could reduce GDP growth by up to 6% in some regions by 2050. The United Nations has identified water stress as a threat multiplier for conflict, migration, and political instability. Countries from North Africa to South Asia to the American Southwest are already searching for solutions, and they're looking to the two nations that have the most to offer. China's export strategy is infrastructure heavy. Through the Belt and Road Initiative and bilateral development agreements, Chinese state-owned enterprises have built hundreds of water-related projects across the developing world. In Pakistan, Chinese companies have constructed dams and irrigation canals as part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. In sub-Saharan Africa, Chinese firms have built water treatment plants, drilling operations, and distribution networks in countries from Ethiopia to Nigeria to Angola. These projects are typically financed through Chinese state loans, creating economic relationships that extend far beyond the water sector. The advantage of China's approach is its comprehensiveness. China can offer everything from initial surveying and engineering to construction, financing, and long-term maintenance. For developing nations with limited technical capacity and constrained budgets, a single Chinese package deal is far simpler than assembling expertise from multiple sources. The disadvantage, critics argue, is that these deals often create dependency. Countries take on Chinese debt, rely on Chinese engineers for ongoing maintenance, and find themselves locked into Chinese technology ecosystems. Some observers describe this as a modern form of resource influence, where water infrastructure becomes a tool for strategic positioning rather than purely developmental aid. Israel's export strategy is technology-focused. Israeli companies license desalination technology, sell irrigation systems, provide consulting on water management, and train engineers from client nations. The model is less about building physical infrastructure and more about transferring knowledge and selling innovation. Companies like IDE Technologies, Netafim, Mekarot, and WaterGen have become global brands in the water sector, with operations spanning dozens of countries. Israel's approach has the advantage of flexibility. Its technologies can be adapted to different scales and contexts, from large-scale desalination plants for wealthy Gulf states to small-scale drip irrigation systems for smallholder farmers in India or East Africa. The disadvantage is that Israel lacks China's financial firepower and construction capacity. Israel can design a desalination plant, but it typically needs local or international partners to finance and build it. In competitive bids for major water projects, Chinese firms often have the edge simply because they can offer cheaper financing and faster construction timelines. The competition between these two export models is playing out in real time across the globe's most water-stressed regions. In the Middle East, both countries are active. China has invested in desalination and water infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, while Israeli technology underpins desalination plants across the Gulf. In India, Israel has established deep partnerships on agricultural water technology, while China has invested in Indian water treatment and distribution systems through various bilateral channels. In Africa, China's infrastructure dominance is clear, but Israeli companies are gaining ground in specific niches, particularly drip irrigation and precision agriculture. There's a fascinating emerging dimension to this race: the intersection of water technology with artificial intelligence and data analytics. Both countries are investing in smart water systems, networks of sensors, algorithms, and automated controls that monitor water quality, detect leaks, optimize distribution, and predict demand in real time. Israel's Mekarot, the national water utility, operates one of the world's most advanced smart water grids, using AI to manage the entire national system from a centralized control room. China is deploying similar technology across its major cities, integrating water management into its broader smart city initiatives. The country that masters AI-driven water management could gain an even larger export advantage because the technology is inherently scalable. A smart water algorithm developed for Tel Aviv can, with adaptation, be deployed in Mumbai or Nairobi or Sao Paulo. A leak detection system designed for Beijing's aging pipe network could be applied to any city with similar infrastructure challenges. In this domain, the competition between China and Israel is not just about water. It's about data, artificial intelligence, and the digital infrastructure that will underpin resource management in the 21st century. There's also a wild card that could reshape the entire landscape: breakthrough technologies. Several research groups and companies are working on next-generation water solutions that could leapfrog both the Chinese and Israeli models. Forward osmosis, graphene-based filtration membranes, solar-power desalination, and direct atmospheric water harvesting are all in various stages of development. If any of these technologies achieves commercial viability at scale, it could democratize water production in ways that undermine the export advantages both China and Israel currently enjoy. A cheap, modular desalination unit powered by solar panels could allow even the poorest coastal communities to produce their own fresh water, bypassing the need for massive infrastructure or expensive technology licensing. But breakthrough technologies are, by definition, uncertain. They might arrive in 5 years or 50. In the meantime, the world's water crisis intensifies, and the two nations best positioned to respond continue to expand their influence. So who really controls the future of water? The honest answer is that it's too early to declare a winner, and the outcome matters more than almost any other technological competition on the planet. China's approach offers scale that no other nation can match. If the engineering holds, if the environmental costs remain manageable, and if the climate doesn't undermine the hydrological assumptions baked into its infrastructure, China's ability to physically reshape water geography gives it an unparalleled tool for both domestic stability and international influence. But the risks are enormous. A changing climate, depleting glaciers, collapsing aquifers, and the ecological consequences of moving rivers across continents are not problems that more concrete and steel can solve. China is making a bet that its engineering capacity can stay ahead of nature's deterioration, and history suggests that's a bet civilizations eventually lose. Israel's approach offers elegance and efficiency. The ability to create fresh water from the sea, to recycle nearly every drop, and to grow crops with a fraction of the water used anywhere else on Earth is genuinely revolutionary. But Israel's model is built for a small, wealthy, technologically advanced coastal nation. Scaling it to serve billions of people in landlocked, low-income, infrastructure-poor regions requires adaptations that haven't yet been proven. And the dependency on energy, the vulnerability of centralized infrastructure, and the environmental costs of brine disposal are challenges that grow, not shrink, with scale. The most likely future is not one where either model dominates exclusively. It's a hybrid world, where Chinese-style mega-infrastructure handles the largest-scale water transfers and storage challenges, while Israeli-style precision technology optimizes efficiency, treatment, and production at every node in the system. The nations and regions that figure out how to combine both approaches, how to integrate large-scale infrastructure with advanced technology, how to balance centralized planning with distributed innovation, will be the ones that survive the water crisis with their economies and societies intact. But there's a darker possibility that neither model addresses. If global temperature rises exceed 2 degrees Celsius, a threshold that current emissions trajectories make increasingly plausible, no amount of engineering may be sufficient to prevent catastrophic water disruption in the most vulnerable parts of the world. The Himalayan glaciers that feed rivers serving 2 billion people could lose a third of their ice mass by the end of the century. Major river basins across Africa, South America, and South Asia could see flow reductions that make even sophisticated water management obsolete. In that scenario, the question of who controls water technology becomes secondary to the question of whether anyone can control the outcome at all. What's certain is that water will define the geopolitics of the 21st century the way oil defined the 20th. The alliances, conflicts, innovations, and failures that emerge from this crisis will reshape borders, topple governments, and determine whether billions of people live in stability or chaos. China and Israel have both understood this earlier and more clearly than almost any other nation on Earth. Their strategies, one built on moving mountains, the other on mastering molecules, represent humanity's two best attempts to engineer its way out of an existential threat. Whether those attempts succeed will depend on factors that no engineer or politician can fully predict. Climate trajectories, population growth, political stability, technological breakthroughs, and the willingness of nations to cooperate rather than compete over a shared resource. All of these variables will interact in ways that are impossible to model with certainty. What we know is that the race is underway, the stakes could not be higher, and the outcome will touch every human life on the planet. 5 years from now, you'll hear about water crises on the news and understand exactly what forces are driving them. 10 years from now, you'll see nations choosing sides, aligning with Chinese infrastructure or Israeli technology as they scramble to secure their own water futures. 20 years from now, the decisions being made today in Beijing and Tel Aviv will have become the invisible architecture of a world that either adapted or didn't. The future of water is being written right now, and the two countries writing it couldn't be more different. or more determined? If you want more stories about the technologies and power struggles shaping our future, subscribe to Next Breakdown, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Which approach do you think gives humanity the best chance? Let us know.